Hey everyone. So, the article that we are going to read for today's lesson is The Teen Brain. It's just not grown up. And you can get the link to this article in today's lesson. So, once again, I just want to remind you all that we have started our new unit, and this unit focuses on the teenage brain and the development of the teenage brain and how it affects teenage behaviors. So I'm going to begin reading from here. And before we begin reading, as a matter of fact, I just want to go over what the questions are for this article. The classwork question is going to be what does the article say about the frontal lobes in the teenage brain? Why is this important? And the exit ticket question is simply asking you to state what the main idea of the article is, what the article is mostly about. All right, so these are some things that we want to keep in mind as we read. So let's begin. When, sorry, when adolescence hit Frances Jensen's sons, she often found herself wondering, like all parents of teenagers, what were you thinking? So first of all, when we say adolescence, we're basically talking about teenage years. Adolescent simply means a young adult or teenager. It's a resounding mantra of parents and teachers, says Jensen, who's a pediatric neurologist at Children's Hospital in Boston. So a pediatric neurologist is someone who studies the brains of young children. So a neurologist is someone who studies brains, and a pediatric is someone who works with children. All right, so this person, Jensen, studies children's brains. Like when son number one, Andrew, turned 16, dyed his hair black with red stripes and went off to school wearing studded leather and platform shoes, and his grades went south. I watched my child morph into another being, and yet I knew deep down inside it was the same Andrew, Jensen says. Suddenly, her own children seemed like an alien species. So what we have here is a little anecdote or a short story that Jensen is telling us about how she saw her child, Andrew, suddenly go through these changes when she was 16, when Andrew turned 16. Jensen is a Harvard expert on epilepsy, not adolescent brain development. As she coped with her boys' sour moods and their exasperating assumption that somebody else will pick up their dirty clothes, she decided to investigate what neuroscientists are discovering about teenagers' brains that makes them behave that way. So neuroscientists are scientists that study the brain. Teenage brains are different. She learned that it's not so much what teens are thinking, it's how. Jensen says scientists used to think human brain development was pretty complete by age 10. Or, as she puts it, that a teenage brain is just an adult brain with fewer miles on it. But it's not. To begin with, she says, a crucial part of the brain, the frontal lobes, are not fully connected. Really? So this is where we should be paying attention to in particular, because let's remind ourselves that the classwork question asks us what the article says about frontal lobes in the teenage brain. And why is this important? So the frontal lobes, we all know now that they're an important part of the brain, right? And in the teenage brain, the frontal lobes are not fully connected. Why is this important? Let's find out. The frontal lobes are the part of the brain that says, is this a good idea? What is the consequence of this action? Jensen says. It's not that they don't have a frontal lobe, and they can use it, but they're going to access it more slowly. So if now we know that the frontal lobes are the part of the brain that are responsible for decision making, thinking ahead, calculating the risks and rewards, right? So that part of the brain in teenagers is undeveloped, is not fully developed yet. That's because the nerve cells that connect teenagers' frontal lobes with the rest of their brains are sluggish. Teenagers don't have as much of the fatty coating called myelin or white matter that adults have in this area. Think of it as insulation on an electrical wire. Nerves need myelin for nerve signals to flow freely. Spotty or thin myelin leads to inefficient communication between one part of the brain and another. A partially connected frontal lobe. Jensen thinks this explains what was going on inside the brain of her younger son, Will, when he turned 16. Like Andrew, he'd been a good student, a straight arrow with good grades and high SAT scores. But one morning on the way to school, he turned left in front of an oncoming vehicle. He and the other driver were okay, but there was serious damage to the car. It was totaled, Will says, down and out, and it was about 10 minutes before morning assembly. So most of the school passed by my wrecked car with me standing next to it. And lo and behold, his mother adds, who was the other driver? It was the 21-year-old, also probably not with a completely connected frontal lobe. Recent studies show that neural insulation isn't complete until the mid-20s. So what that tells us right there is that the brain really doesn't fully develop until a person reaches their mid-20s. So, in other words, a lot of people in their early 20s, and I'm sure you are aware of this, are really not fully mature yet. This also may explain why teenagers often seem so maddeningly self-centered. You think of them as these surly, rude, selfish people, Jensen said. Well, actually, that's the developmental stage they're at. They aren't yet at that place where they're thinking about or capable necessarily of thinking about the effects of their behavior on other people. That requires insight. And insight requires, that's right, a fully connected frontal lobe. So because teenagers don't have a fully connected frontal lobe, they are not fully capable of thinking about how their actions or their behaviors affect other people. Right? So this explains why. Because their frontal lobe is not fully connected, it explains why teenagers have a difficult time making decisions, thinking about the decisions they make and how they will affect themselves or others, thinking about the consequences of their decisions. More vulnerable to addiction. But that's not the only big difference in teenagers' brains. Nature made the brains of children and adolescents excitable. Their brain chemistry is tuned to be responsive to everything in their environment. After all, that's what makes kids learn so easily. But this can work in ways that are not so good. Take alcohol, for example, or nicotine, cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy. Addiction has been shown to be essentially a form of learning, Jensen says. After all, if the brain is wired to form new connections in response to the environment, and potent psychoactive drugs suddenly enter that environment, those substances are tapping into a much more robust habit-forming ability that adolescents have, compared to adults. So studies have shown that a teenager who smokes pot will still show cognitive deficits days later. An adult who smokes the same dose will return to cognitive baseline much faster. This bit of knowledge came in handy in Jensen's own household. Most parents, they'll say, "Don't drink, don't do drugs," says Will, son number 2. And I'm the type of kid who'd say, "Why?" When Will asked why, his mom could give him chapter and verse on drugs and teen brains. So they would know, she says, that if I smoke pot tonight and I have an exam in 2 days' time, I'm going to do worse. It's a fact. There were other advantages to having a neuroscientist mom, Will says, like when he was tempted to pull an all-nighter. She would say, "Read it tonight and then go to sleep," he says. And what she explained to me is that it will take what you've been reading from your short-term memory, and while you sleep, you will consolidate it. And actually, you will know it better in the morning than right before you went to sleep. It worked every time, he says. It also worked for Andrew, the former goth. He's now a senior at Wesleyan University, majoring in physics. I think she's great. I would not be where I am without her in my life. Andrew says of his mom, "For any parent who has survived teenagers, there are no sweeter words." All right, so that is the entire article. And once again, let's review the questions for this article. So the classwork question is, what does the article say about the frontal lobes in the teenage brain? Why is this important? So I went over this specifically when we read that particular section, right? Starting from where it says teenage brains are different, right? So this whole section, and even if you read a little bit after, starting from a partially connected frontal lobe, if you reread that section again, you will be able to answer that question. All right, what it says about frontal lobes in teenagers and how it affects their behaviors. All right, I just gave you a hint. Why is it important? You can think of how it affects their behaviors. And lastly, for the exit ticket, what does this article mostly talk about? All right, what is it mostly about? So you don't want to get into too much detail, simply stating what the main idea of the article is. All right, so that's everything for the classwork and the exit ticket. The homework is actually not going to be on based on this article. It's going to be based on this video. I'm going to post a link on the lesson, and there's going to be a separate assignment for that. All right, and that is all for today.